Good morning. Are you going to stay? You're not going to the children's class? I'm tickled pink to be here today. I have a friend called Jolitz who, he's there. He's taken the day off work, and I promised Jolitz that I was going to come to the lectureship this year, and I admitted to him I'd been a bit slack and didn't go too many places, so I promised him that I was going to go, and then I get invited to speak, and that's really good too. I can't remember how long ago it was since I was here. It's got to be approaching 40 years. So I do feel a bit uncomfortable that you've turned this room around. I felt pretty comfortable that you didn't change the toilets. I was a bit concerned about that. So I'm really, really happy to be here. Had a bit of a trick this morning. I thought I was preaching tomorrow, but I got up really early and started just kind of writing out my sermon. I'd really thought it out, and so I got through the first 2 points and halfway through the last, and then Sue Shepherd sent me the schedule, and I was preaching today, so that was interesting. But then I went back and got my sermon and I finished it. Nothing like a little bit of anxiety to make your class a little bit better. I grabbed my 2 sermon topics without giving a lot of thought to them, but I just wanted to get what I thought were the best ones and then see what I could do with them after that. So I gave titles to this, so I had the titles before I had anything else, and that's not a great way to do sermons. It's better to do the sermons first and then come up with the title, but I thought the other guys would take all the good ones, so I just grabbed what I wanted. So there we go. I'm calling it The Greatest Love of All, and it really kind of is about that, but you'll have to wait till I get to my 3rd point to see that. Whitney Houston. I saw her once in concert. She wasn't at her best. It was kind of towards the end, but she has got some beautiful songs, and the song that I'm thinking about, of course, is The Greatest Love of All. It's a beautiful song, but have you ever... There's nothing wrong with the words, by the way, but if you actually listened to the words and understood them, what she says is that the greatest love of all is learning to love yourself. And that's not a bad idea. That's not a bad idea. But I want to tell you that that's really not the greatest love of all. I'm going to talk to you about Jesus. I'm going to talk to you about God sending Jesus. I'm going to talk to you about Jesus demonstrating God's love on Calvary and showing us what God's love's really about. So that's really what I want to talk to you about. And I could probably just read this verse and sit down, but I'm not going to because preachers don't do that. So let's just go to Romans chapter 5 and read with me, if you will, verses 6 through 8. So Paul's talking to the Roman Christians here. He says, "You see, at the right time, when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous man, though for a good man someone might possibly dare to die. But God," this is the kicker, but God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. All right? So the situation was that we couldn't save ourselves. The world was in a terrible mess. Paul describes mankind as being powerless, ungodly, and sinners. So that's how he describes mankind. That's how he describes the world at that time. When he uses the word powerless, he's talking about spiritual powerlessness. He's saying that mankind had no way of solving the sin problem that they had in their life. Mankind had no way of addressing their ungodliness. Mankind had no way of establishing a relationship with God. They were just absolutely powerless to do it. They were unable to do it. He says that he describes mankind as being ungodly. So that's people without God, opposed to God, hostile to God. And he describes mankind as being sinners, and that means that mankind were living in rebellion against God's ways. So it doesn't get much worse than that. Now, Paul's interesting though, and I've been talking about how Paul said this about mankind: they're ungodly, they're sinners, but Paul actually says we. So Paul says in verse 6, you see, at just the right time when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. So Paul's saying this is about me and it's about you. We were ungodly and we were sinners and we couldn't do anything about it. So that's what Paul's saying. He says we had that problem. Now, you probably know, but the church in Rome had Gentile Christians as part of the congregation, and it had Jewish Christians as part of the congregation. And it's really interesting that in Romans 1, that Paul says this about the Gentiles: having been filled, they were filled with every kind of wickedness. And then he says, and I think this is really awful, he says, they even invented ways to be evil. The established ways to be evil weren't good enough. They had to invent more. So that's how he describes the Gentiles. And there were Gentiles in this congregation that he was writing to. And he says to you Jews, he says, you know better. You know better than the Gentiles. Jews were no better than the Gentiles. He says in Romans 2, he says, you say that you shouldn't steal and then you steal yourself. He says, you say that you shouldn't commit adultery and then you do that yourselves. But then he gets really harsh. I'll see if I can find the verse. He says, you brag about the law. You who brag about the law, do you dishonour? So he's talking to Jews. He's not talking to the Jewish Christians. They've kind of sorted things out. But he's talking to Jews, and that's where they used to be. You who brag about the law, do you dishonour God by breaking the law? As it is written, this is really harsh, God's name is blasphemed amongst the Gentiles because of you. That's awful, isn't it? That's absolutely awful. And that's the situation, that's the horrible situation that the world was in before Calvary. Now, you've just got to put up with me because I like to tell stories when I teach. Who's ever heard of a thing called a chittling sausage? A chittling sausage. Well, I hadn't either. I was holidaying with my son and my grandson, and we were in Arras, France. I think I've said it right. And we were looking at the Somme, and we were looking at Flanders. And we go into a lovely French restaurant. You know, France is full of really good food. Now, I don't know what I ordered, and I don't know what my grandson ordered, but my son ordered something that didn't say chittling sausage, but that's what it is. Now, you need to Google chittling sausage because you're not going to believe this. They are made up of pig's intestines, sometimes others, but mostly pig's intestines and stomach. That's not so bad. It's described as having a very distinctive smell and taste. Now, you're not going to believe me, and this is a bit crass, but it says sometimes it smells a little bit like feces. So anyway, my son orders this stuff, and they're white, by the way, so that's how you keep away from them. Don't eat white sausages. So my son orders this stuff, and I can tell you it didn't disappoint. It smelt horrible, and it tasted horrible. He had a little bit of a taste. He let me have a little bit of a taste. My grandson wasn't that stupid. All right. It was just really, really horrible stuff. Now, what am I talking about chittling sausages for? I want you to know that the world before Christ had a lot in common with chittling sausages. It was horrible. It was absolutely horrible. And mankind was ungodly. They were living as sinners. They were in rebellion against God. So that's the situation before Christ. So I'm just thinking, I got my second point here. I'm thinking of John Gray, and if I was preaching a sermon, practicing a sermon up the front from there, and I'd say, this is my second point, he'd hold up 3 fingers. Just to put me off. David never did that because David was a lot more sensible. So he never did that. But John Gray did. He probably would today if he was here. But anyway, this is my second point. So when Christ died for the world on Calvary, the world was in a horrible mess. I just want you to see that. I want you to understand that. Now, let's look at chapter 5, verse 7. Paul says, very rarely will anyone die for a righteous man, though for a good man someone might possibly dare to die. So Paul says, very rarely, and then he said, possibly, somebody might die for an ungodly man or a good man. Well, you know, who would do that? And anyway, you don't have to worry about it because Paul said there aren't anybody. There wasn't anybody that was good. There wasn't anybody that was godly. So you don't have to worry about answering that question. So who would do it? Who would die for an ungodly sinner? Who would do that? You know, maybe I'd die for, I hope I would die for somebody that was a very, very close loved one. But if you're ungodly and a sinner, I'm sorry, but you're on your own. I wouldn't die for that sort of person. Well, who would do that? Who would die for the ungodly and a sinner? And Paul gives the answer. He gives the answer in verse 6. You see, at just the right time, when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. That's who did it. That's who would do it. That's who did it. And then in verse 8, he said, but God demonstrates his own love for us, that while we were still sinners, God died for us, that Christ died for us. God is Christ, so that's not really too wrong. So Christ died for us while we were still sinners. So that's who was prepared, and that's who did die for the ungodly. That's who was prepared and who did die for sinners. So, another story, and this is a true story. But have you ever been at your wit's end? Have you ever been in a situation where you were absolutely overwhelmed by a problem and that you didn't have a clue how to sort it out? It's kind of funny that problems that we had when we were young, they really weren't that big a problem, but at that stage they were kind of really big. And I was about 18. I had uni to go to, I had a class to go to at uni, and then after uni I had to go to KFC to work my shift, but we didn't call it KFC in those days, we called it Kentucky Fried Chicken. So I used to work about 14 hours there when I was going to uni, and so I had to go to uni and I had to go to my shift at work, and I had a real problem with my car. Now, I'm not really mechanical, but when my car was using more automatic transmission fluid than petrol, I realised that there was a problem. There was a problem with my car. And it was doing that for a couple of days, and I just didn't know what to do. My dad and mum lived on the outskirts, just out in the country, just a little bit from Brisbane, but about half an hour from where I was flatting. And Dad had a ramp. He'd built a ramp, a big wooden ramp out the back. They had a chook farm. And so I took my car out there and I had to drive down by the house, down the back, and I put my car up on the ramp, and I got out of my car and I got down on the ground and looked up at my car, my motor and my transmission. I don't know, I think I was expecting God to tap me on the shoulder. I'm telling you, I was really upset. I felt overwhelmed with the problem and I didn't have any way of sorting it out. Now, I'll tell you something else. My dad was a really difficult man. My dad, it was a difficult man on anybody's estimation. He was a really difficult man. I drove down past the house. I had to go right down the back. We had acreage. And my dad gets up really early, so he must have heard me drive down past the house. But anyway, he's only a little bloke. I'm only a little bloke, but he's a really little bloke. And he comes down and he sees me under the car, and I could have been crying. I can't really remember, but I was really, really upset. And Dad's not known for being warm and fuzzy, but I can tell you what he did. He took me to uni. I didn't have shoes on. That was a bit of a shock to Dad. I hadn't bothered putting shoes on that day, so he took me to uni without shoes. I think he did comment on that. And then he waited till I'd finished my class, and then he took me to work at Kentucky Fried Chicken. And then he picked me up later on that day in my car, which he'd fixed. All right. I'll never forget that. That is probably one of the nicest memories that I've got of my dad. I didn't have a clue what to do. I had no ability to sort out my situation, but my dad took care of it for me. And you know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about our dad in heaven. I'm saying that we didn't have a clue to how to fix our situation, that we were overwhelmed with the problem and couldn't sort it out, but God sorted it out for us through Jesus. Christ died for the world on Calvary, even when the world was horrible. Christ died for mankind when they were in open rebellion against God, when they were absolutely ungodly. Now, I want us to think about this. Christ's dying for the ungodly and the sinners demonstrates what God's love is really like. What God did at Calvary demonstrates what God's love is really like. That's what Paul says in verse 6. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. All right. Paul wrote that, and he just didn't think, oh, well, there's a few more words that I need to put in that passage. You know, the Holy Spirit didn't say, well, I just need to make that look a bit prettier. Verse 8 is really important. God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. So the word demonstrate, you could use the word show or proves. I think some versions have the word prove, that God proved his love for us, that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Demonstrate's got the idea of making something evident in a convincing and undeniable way. Did I copy that from somebody? Yes, I did. Demonstrate has the idea of making something evident in a convincing and undeniable way. So Paul is saying that the act of Christ dying at Calvary demonstrates and makes evident to us what God's love is really like. Well, what does it show us about God's love? What does it demonstrate to us about God's love? It demonstrates the unconditional nature of God's love. The fact that Jesus died for mankind when they were still sinners demonstrates that God's love is not dependent on human merit. It's not based on human merit or worthiness. And I thank God for that. God's love is extended to people. God's love is extended to the world when they don't deserve it. The death of Jesus on Calvary tells us something else about God's love. It tells us about the sacrificial nature of God's love. God's profound sacrifice of Christ on Calvary demonstrates that God doesn't hold anything back. God gave his absolute all, and he was willing to do that to reconcile mankind to himself. He was willing to take on the sin of the world. And the death of Jesus on Calvary tells us that. It tells us just how sacrificial God's love is. All right. It also tells us that God's love is not just about pretty words. All right? You know, often when we talk about love, we just kind of use pretty words. But that's not what God's love's about. God's love was about action. God's love demonstrated at Calvary was about how he was willing to enter our history in the person of Jesus Christ and go to Calvary and die for us. Now that's action. That's not pretty words. That's action, and that's what what Jesus' death on Calvary shows us about God's love. Now, look, perhaps we could reach inside of ourselves and come up with the courage, maybe the sacrificial love that would cause us to die for a very, very close loved one. And I think I could, but I don't know that I could. I've got a couple of grandchildren that I think I could do that for if I really had to. Wouldn't like to, but I think I could do that. Maybe my kids too, but grandchildren are so much better. But they're young and they're vulnerable, aren't they? They're young and they're vulnerable. Maybe I could do that, but that's not what God did. God didn't die for his friends. God died for people who were ungodly and living in rebellion against him. Who knows what happened in August 1945? Do you know, Les? Les knows these things. Yep, and I'll ask you the particular date. Were they dropped on the same day? Yep. So that's when America dropped the atom bombs on those two cities in Japan. They did it to force the unconditional surrender of Japan in World War II. They did it, that's what we're told, to save the immense casualties which would have been involved in a land invasion. Maybe they didn't do that at all. Maybe it was just to show the Soviet Union that they had the bomb and the Soviet Union needed to watch themselves. That's what kind of some cynics think. But regardless, I think it was 6 days after the last bomb was dropped, that Japan did unconditionally surrender. The atom bomb demonstrated the military might of America. That's what it demonstrated. And the demonstration brought about the capitulation. I like that. I wasn't planning that, but demonstration, capitulation, guys, put up with me. It demonstrated that military might, and Japan unconditionally surrendered. Well, the dropping of the bomb certainly affected history, didn't it? It certainly had an impact upon our history. But I'm telling you that the demonstration of what God did on Calvary has had a lot more impact upon our history. And I'm telling you that it's not just about history, but it's eternal future. That's right. And it shows us that. It shows us what a marvellous love God has for his people. It shows us that nothing matches God's love. So you can tell me what you like, but if you tell me that God doesn't love you, then I'd have to tell you you're wrong, and that God proved that he loved you at Calvary. He demonstrated his love for you at Calvary. Now, you might think that you're insignificant and unworthy and that God wouldn't want to have a relationship with you, but if you think that, then I'd have to tell you you're wrong again. Because you don't have to be deserving of God's love. I just find it amazing. Sometimes strange things happen in my head, and I'm in the city and everybody's walking around on the streets and what have you. And I think God loves those people every bit as much as he loves me. I find that hard to get my head around because I'm thinking that God's day revolves around me. But I know that's not true. I know that's not true. That's the way I can think of love. I just can't think about God's love being immeasurable and being for everybody. But that is the truth. So there you go. Whitney Houston's song's a pretty good song. It's probably oldies. Have you ever heard it, you young ones? Oh, yeah, some young people have heard it. It's a pretty good song, but I'm telling you that what God did for us at Calvary is a lot more important and much more worthy for us to sing about. So we're going to do a little bit of singing now. We're going to be doing some more singing about God's love. So I'm already having a great time. I've just spoken to a bunch of people that I haven't seen for years, and I'm so glad I've come to the lectureship. And thank you for inviting me to speak, Peter.